Well, I want to dig into some of the specifics in this document. And so I really want to focus first on protein because this guideline heavily emphasized protein intake. And there was a lot of changes with where we've been the last several decades to where we are now. And so I would love for one of you to unpack, like, what do the new guidelines tell us about our protein intake and how should we interpret this message?
Well, I mean, as a preventive cardiology PA, I kind of welcome this message, and I don't know that it was really like add a lot more protein as much as let's swap things. I think that's the message here is that we're not in a protein deficient, at least not in the U.S. I not whole swaths aren't protein deficient. Of course, disparities being what they are. The problem is what's available is processed proteins and then processed foods. And so here, if you can make a swap towards, yes, people make a big deal about, well, red meat, red meat, red meat, but that wasn't. I mean, it was clarified, and you could see red meat reported, and even in that upside down pyramid, you might see that. But they didn't go away from recommending, lean and then fish, etc. So I think here it wasn't really more protein at all costs, but making it more available to the public of less processed. And then, for us, it's like, yes, you can eat meat, just don't pick the marbled meats, because that's where you have this tension of saturated fats, because we're saying less than 10%, but then you might get it in the marbled meats. So I don't know that it was you can do low carb, high fat, and that they weren't expressly saying, the carnivore diet or the keto, but that in this case, we can use meat as a swap for refined sugars and processed things. I don't know. I would love your take on this, Kaplan.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with everything you're saying. And I know there has been a lot of discussion around protein and the prioritization of protein. And I agree that a lot of people are expressing concern about the increased that there has been an increase, their recommendation to increase your intake. But the amount that is being recommended now is still falling within what we call the AMDR, or the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. So yes, it is an increase, but also the long-standing recommendation based on the dietary reference intakes of consuming 0.8 grams per kilogram of protein per day for adults. It is now in these dietary guidelines recommended to increase that to 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein. So the 0.8 is actually based on nitrogen studies and nitrogen balance studies. And what we have seen is that these nitrogen balance studies actually tend to overestimate intake and underestimate like nitrogen expenditure. So the 0.8 might actually not be the best reflection of the amount of protein we need really to optimize our health and well-being. So even though there have been some concerns, I think we still need some more research to really understand, should we be concerned about this increased level, especially, like I said, given that it's still following within that acceptable macronutrient distribution range. I think the other thing when it comes to like the prioritization on protein to really emphasize is that, yes, most Americans are eating an adequate intake, just like Viet had said. Of course, there are some populations that are not, such as the elderly. They tend to fall short. But when we look at protein, that's when we're looking at protein as a whole. But there are these subgroups, like Viet had said, where we are still having insufficient intakes of. So we tend to have adequate, if not excessive, intakes of poultry and beef and eggs here in America, but we tend to fall notably short when we look at seafood intake and shellfish intake, and we look at things like nuts and seeds. So I think when it comes to prioritization, not putting as much emphasis on the quantity maybe, but putting emphasis on really prioritizing like the quality of the proteins that Americans are eating, and really trying to focus in on those food sources of protein that we have been lacking in for so long and really consuming inadequate intakes.
I'm really glad you mentioned quantity versus quality because I think that's where the clinician can really come in and educate the patient. Like, we're not recommending that you get your 100 grams of protein from only supplements, right? From a protein shake, protein bars, and all these, those are processed foods. We're recommending that you're getting it from whole food sources, high quality protein, which includes animal products and also plant-based proteins. And so I'm curious your thoughts on the image because I have heard a lot of concerned that the image doesn't necessarily reflect what the actual guidelines, the wording actually says when it comes to protein, right? The image is very heavy. You've got a lot of the animal products, meat products up top, and then the plant-based proteins kind of get an honorable mention, sort of somewhere sprinkled in. So, do you think that messaging can be confusing for the consumer, or what are your thoughts on that? The image versus what the messaging says.
I do feel there is some misalignment between what the text is communicating and the actual food guide, the visual. I think the text is supporting exactly what you said, in demonstrating recommendations based on evidence and really supporting a lot of what the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee had recommended. I think there is some potential. The food guide, the image might be confusing not only to consumers but also to clinicians and other professionals as well. I think some of the portion sizes might cause some confusion, such as like the image of the steak, the image of the chicken or the turkey, the poultry with the bone-in skin on. So I think not only like the types of foods where they fall in the food guide, but also the portions might be a little bit challenging. And Colleen, something else that you had mentioned about with regards to quality that came out in the text that the food guide image can't portray and it's hard to portray is with regards to quality. I think the text did a really nice job emphasizing the paying attention to the way that protein foods are being prepared, because even a protein food that we consider to be healthy, such as a boneless, skinless chicken breast or seafood, we can make it unhealthy with the way that we prepare it. So I think the text did a really nice job kind of highlighting, putting a prioritization or a focus in on food preparation as well.
Viet, do you have any comments on that?
I'm like, so Catherine, that's salmon that I just have all buttery and it's not quite what they meant, right? But I almost like that food pyramid makes me think of like maps and how that distortion occurs. But like anything up at the top, is just like massive. But really in reality, if you put a huge chicken on there and say that's the portion you need, probably not ideal. And who knows what happened there? Maybe it was AI and fortunately we didn't have a six-finger person or something like that. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. When you look at that pyramid, it's like, wow. And I'm looking at it now and I'm thinking that could be really confusing. And that's what I saw actually in Facebook posts from people who sent this out to one another and like, oh, it's so awesome. We can do. I'm like, you didn't read the text. And so it is a little bit confusing and disconnected. It's not aligned well with the actual, recommendations are.